Welcome back to another meet recap. If you haven't seen my last meet recap of my client Jack Rosen's meet, what I'm really trying to do with this video is essentially just talk about a lot of the programming strategies, the tapering strategies, and then the decision making going into the attempt selection, and then what happened on meet day for my client Daniel In's most recent meet. He competed just a few weeks ago at the Dan Campos Fitness Water Ice Classic, and we had a pretty solid meet with a lot of things to kind of go over. So let's get right into it. So just to go over some basic stats, Dan is a 100 kilo lifter in the USAPL. He weighed in at 97.3 kilos or 214 pounds. This is his second meet. This is going to be our first one working together. So we had done a meet prior in the 105 kilo weight class in Powerlifting America, and we've been working together since November of 2023. He competed at the end of April of 2023. So we had only been together for a little bit over half a year, so 6 months. The numbers that he started with was a 590 kilo total or 1,300 pound total, squatting 479 pounds or 217 kilos, 117 and a half kilos or 259 pounds, and 255 kilos or 562 pounds. This most recent meet, he put on 15 kilos onto his total, but only went 7 for 9. He totaled 605 kilos or 1,334 pounds, squatted 220 kilos or 484 pounds, benched 132 and a half kilos or 292 pounds, and deadlifted 252 and a half kilos or 555 pounds, and had a DOTS of 367, which was, I think, approximately a 10 DOTS PR. Leading up into the meet, his best numbers were a 500-pound double on squats, a 290-pound double on bench, and then a 545-pound single at 8 on deadlift. So getting into squat, Daniel is a very, very, very gifted squatter. He has very short femurs, but he stands very wide. His toes are very ducked outwards, and he has a little bit of a hard time hitting depth. We figured out around 2 weeks out or 3 weeks out that if he wore heels, he could hit depth a little bit easier. We saw that there wasn't a significant reduction in strength, so we decided to go with heels in order for a little bit more depth consistency there. But we obviously took a little bit of a hit. Because Daniel's squat is so wide and because he commands such a powerful position when he squats, generally squatting will just beat him up a ton and generate a ton of fatigue. And we found this in one of our first blocks working together, where if we pushed even a top set on a secondary day, his squat would just tank and he wouldn't really be able to perform on a primary day. So therefore, if you can see, look at the secondary day on this Tuesday session, right? It's really only 3 sets, triple at 6, and then 80% and 86% with some ascending back down. So these are all pause squats, so the weight would be relatively a lot lighter. And you can see that, relative to a 500-pound squatter, 370 pounds is really nothing, even for some pause triples. And this is approximately around like 70 to 73%. And we pretty much just linearly progress this pretty much 5 pounds every single week, going from, 360 on the first, 370 on the week 1 into 375 on the week 2, and then hitting 375 again on the week 3 after a pretty heavy squat single here, where he felt a little bit more beat up. Now, because this session was so light, we really just saw it as almost a primer session, which tried to feed into this Friday squat session where we'd only push a single exertion of a little bit of a higher weight over 400 pounds, and his back downs would still be relatively meaningless. So 3 sets of 4 with about 66%, which was increased only about 1% per week. You can see we started around 66%, and we pretty much finished the prep around 68%. So really nothing crazy here. We would pretty much just use the exposure from the squat single, the weekly squat single, in order to get all of the actual stimulating work of squats in, and then use the rest of the volume simply as skill practice. We saw that the single on squat would fatigue him enough to the point where if he just took a squat single, he'd feel pretty beat up for the next couple of days. So we knew that there was really no reason to need to push anything other than that squat single, and just keep the rest of the back down volume and also the secondary day volume relatively light. Now, going into bench press, Daniel's bench press programming is very straightforward. It just seems as though the bigger he gets, the stronger he gets, and the more muscle he's able to put on, the better his bench press gets. And there's really no cheating, right? He doesn't have a very big arch, doesn't have a very wide grip. His arms are relatively long. So bench press training is pretty straightforward. He benches 3 times a week. His primary day is just a top triple followed by some back down close grip sixes. His tertiary day is a primer single, which we use as a Spoto bench press because he had some problems with his pausing, followed by some higher rep Larson work. And then his primary bench day is simply just a single, and then a top set of 3 followed by some back downs of 4. And he has a very normal amount of pressing accessories, just some flat dumbbell press here, and then some weighted dips on his secondary day afterwards. Something that we found that worked particularly well for Daniel's bench press was to pretty much stay within a certain intensity zone on this primer single here, right? You can see that the weight doesn't necessarily deviate too much. It actually may go down or go up, right? But we pretty much stay around the 255 to 265 mark throughout the entirety of prep. If you look at prior blocks, he does the exact same thing there. And we found that as long as he's within that zone of intensity, he comes into this Saturday session feeling very, very, very strong. So essentially what we did the entirety of prep was just to try and make sure that this day wasn't loaded too heavy, no matter how strong he felt, no matter how weak we felt. If he felt strong, he would take the higher end of the range. And if he felt weak, he would take the lower end of the range. And as long as, the rest of the sessions weren't overshot, as long as this top set essentially wasn't overshot, he would pretty reliably show up very strong on this Saturday session, which we, made sure that he did every single time. Now, Daniel's deadlift is a little bit more peculiar. There's a ton of interference between squat and deadlift, but really no interference between deadlift and squat at all. So a big difficulty was trying to make sure we were doing enough workload on squat so that he could progress on that while also making sure that he was able to progress on deadlifts at the same time, which didn't seem like they would coexist very well. On a secondary day, he would only have 2 sets of some 2-count pause deadlift that were extremely, extremely light, followed by some Romanian deadlifts, only 2 sets of those as well. And then going into his primary session, just a top single followed by some higher rep backdowns, which we had found worked well in the past. Now, as I mentioned previously, the biggest problem leading into this prep was to try and get squat and deadlift to coexist at the exact same time. Now, the strategy that we converged upon was to actually use the squat taper to taper the deadlift, right? So because we knew that taking such a heavy squat on this Friday would typically leave Daniel very smoked coming into the Saturday session, there was really no reason to not assume that if he just didn't squat on this Friday, that this deadlift day would show up pretty strong. So because he competed on a Saturday, we lined up his bench and his deadlift on this Saturday, and then we kept his squat onto this Friday. And all we really did was on the meet week, just shift the squat up one day. So essentially, instead of squatting Tuesday and Friday, now we would squat Wednesday and Saturday, which would kind of line up to meet day perfectly. And then what that would also do is it would give him essentially 3 days of rest, 2 days of rest between the final squat session and then the primary deadlift session, right? So in his typical week, he would squat on Tuesday and deadlift on Tuesday, and then he would squat on Friday, which would typically leave him smoked for Saturday. And we would know that if he probably took away this squat session and just treated this day as a rest day, his lower body would feel strong enough coming into the Saturday session that he would actually be able to put on a relatively good performance. So we relied on the squat being tapered in order to taper the deadlift, and we essentially did no deadlift tapering whatsoever. And with squat, we had a very reliable structure in that, we saw that this Friday session consistently showed up very, very strong. And all we really did was just adjusted the days, made sure that he was training into the meet and not really taking a very quote unquote final heavy single of prep leading into the meet. All we really did was for the prior 3 blocks, we transitioned from triples to doubles to singles, and essentially just treated meet day as a week 4 primary session. So with this strategy, because we knew that Daniel would consistently show up on his primary sessions, all we really needed to do was to just push his secondary session 1 day back, so that the exposure timing would line up, and then he would have his typical 3 days of rest between his secondary day and his primary day, and he would show up on Saturday on meet day, essentially just doing a primary squat single. This training into the meet model was very similar for bench press, where we essentially just took a single at 8, just 1 week out. We would essentially try and have this weight to be around second attempt range, and then we would see if we could have another, 5 kilos or 10 pounds on this single going into meet day. But because his bench already lined up on Saturday and we really had to change nothing with his microcycle, all we really needed to do was just make sure we didn't go too heavy on this day and that we left some room in the tank for him to progress into going into meet day, and then just treated meet day again like a week 4 primary single. And as I said before, with deadlift, all we really used was the adjustment of the squat days and the squat taper in order to taper deadlifts. So throughout the entire final block of prep, deadlifts weren't really pushed too hard, knowing that they were masked by the fatigue generated by squatting the day prior. So we really didn't push it too much, only pretty much taking, a heaviest single at 7 on that final week of prep. And then going into meet day, we would kind of just unleash the beast, as I kind of told Daniel, and allow deadlift to kind of flourish there. Now, going into the attempt sheet, Daniel had the biggest goal of squatting 500 pounds. He just really wanted to squat 500 pounds in the meet. And as you can see, when we go over the attempts on meet day, that goal was heavily taken into consideration. He also really likes very big jumps on squat. We found that if he took attempts a little bit too close together, each attempt would essentially just fatigue the next one. So we would have to be pretty strategic with the way that we took our jumps and the way that we kind of opened on squat. So we opened very light with something he had taken for singles at 6, singles at 5 with 205 kilos or 452 pounds. We would take a pretty big jump, just essentially taking the smallest jump possible so that we could set ourselves up for what we thought we had on the day. And we knew that Daniel had squatted 500 pounds for 2 reps, the block prior to the last block of prep, so the penultimate block of prep. So we thought that he would have around 518 pounds on meet day with just a slight taper. Going into bench press, we really had the goal of just making sure that he would be able to bench 300 pounds. We were fairly confident about this, given that 290 pounds moved extremely well on that final week of training. So we thought that 303 pounds would be appropriate. So we opened at 125 kilos or 275 pounds, jumped 7.5 kilos to 132.5 kilos or 292 pounds, and then plan to take the third attempt jump of 5 kilos to 137.5 kilos or 303 pounds. And then finally deadlift, which was our problem child throughout the entirety of prep. We really didn't know how strong we were on deadlift, but we knew that we would definitely be able to go for a PR. His deadlift PR at the time was 255 kilos or 562 pounds. So we thought that it would be appropriate to aim for just a small 2.5 kilo jump, given that deadlifts weren't necessarily the greatest lift throughout prep, but we knew that it would probably be there. So we were relatively confident that we could take 257.5 kilos or 568 pounds for a 2.5 kilo meet PR. Now, leading into his opener squat, Daniel said he didn't necessarily feel too strong warming up. He felt like the bar didn't feel that heavy on his back, but he didn't necessarily feel like he had too much pop out of the hole. And as you can see, this opener definitely moved a little bit heavier than we would have liked to. Definitely a little bit of a sticking point. But as said before, depth was a primary concern, and he had all 3 white lights on this attempt. So we were fairly confident going into the next attempt. I took a smaller 15 kilo jump compared to our planned 17.5 kilo jump, going up to 220 kilos or 485 pounds from 205 kilos. Just so that we could try and set ourselves up for a 500-pound squat at the end of the day. Now, looking at a second attempt, this didn't necessarily move too well. There was definitely a little bit more of a grind than I would have liked to. And as Daniel said before, squats weren't necessarily feeling too well, but I've seen Daniel grind out a very heavy squat before, so I thought that the 500-pound goal would still be there on the day. Now, looking at his third attempt, we jumped to 227 kilos or 501 pounds, and it just wasn't there on the day. The goal was to really just squat 500 pounds, but he just couldn't really put it together. Now, the biggest takeaway from this underwhelming squat performance was essentially that as you get stronger, the equipment that you train on matters more, right? Daniel is an incredibly strong squatter. He squats over 500 pounds for reps. However, the gym that he was training at had extremely large plates, with essentially 500 pounds being all the way outside the sleeves, on top of the bar being a little bit more whippy than the bar that was used on competition day. So he would be able to almost time his ascent on the squat with the upwards whip of the bar because the plates were so far outwards, because the bar was so whippy, that he would essentially get an extra boost out of the hole compared to if he was squatting on calibrated kilo plates and a calibrated bar. So it would make sense that Daniel didn't necessarily feel the same amount of pop out of the hole as he did compared to in training, and he didn't necessarily have 500 pounds on this day because as the plates got further away from the bar, the more whip that he got and the more boost that he got out of the hole, regardless of the weight. We saw signs of this in the warm-up room where 154 pounds felt fine, 264 pounds felt fine, 375 pounds felt fine. However, anything over 375 pounds or 3 reds just felt extremely slow, and he didn't really feel like he was able to get much out of the hole. So in hindsight, we should have adjusted for this. However, we didn't really know how much the calibrated plates would affect Daniel's squat, but we will know for next meet. Once squat was over, Daniel felt like a lot of the momentum going into the meet had been stopped. Squat was almost his bread and butter lift, and he felt like if he wasn't able to squat 500 pounds on the day, he felt like he wouldn't just generally be strong on the day. And we tried to regroup him after squats, telling him, hey, we still have 6 reps left. We still have 2 lifts left to go. We can still finish the day with a massive meet PR if both other lifts go well, and which we were fairly confident that they would. Now, warming up for bench, Daniel felt relatively strong. A lot of the warm-ups were moving as fast or even faster than I had expected them to. So I knew that we were good for a pretty solid showing out on bench. So we opened here with 125 kilos or 275 pounds. You can see that we get a relatively fast press command, but this moves fairly well. Daniel comes off the platform thinking that it was 253 pounds, and he thought that it felt extremely, extremely heavy. But once I told him that it was 125 kilos or 275 pounds, he was so confident after this rep, and he told me to take the normal planned jump. So we took the planned jump to 132.5 kilos or 292 pounds. It seemed like at this point of the meet, Daniel had almost regained the momentum that he had lost after squats. Because the opener moved so well, he felt extremely confident that this would move as well, and we'd be able to bench 300 pounds in the day. Now, this is kind of just a meet experience thing, but Daniel actually asked for a liftoff and forgot to get the liftoff. So you can see he almost self-unracks, and coming off of the platform after this attempt, he kind of just told me that his brain just shut off for a second. He almost forgot. And once he had unracked and put his butt down and gotten the start command, he just wasn't in the right mindset to actually lift the weight. And you can see that the rep moved insanely, insanely slow, a lot slower than what we would have wanted. So we took the smaller jump to 135 kilos or 297 pounds, and he was fairly confident that he would hit this as well. Now, similarly to squat with bench, if we took too small of a jump, Daniel felt like each attempt would fatigue him for the next one. So we had to be pretty strategic with our jumps, and a 2.5 kilo jump might have been just too small for him, especially how much of a grinder that prior attempt was. So we come out on this attempt with 135 kilos or 297 pounds, and it just wasn't there on the day. Daniel felt like he probably could have gotten it, given that, we didn't have that slight mess up on the second attempt. But regardless, 4 for 6 at this point, and definitely not feeling too excited about the rest of the meet. So at this point in the meet, we had fallen short of the squat goal, we had fallen short of the bench goal, and all we really had was our least favorite lift, deadlifts. So Daniel definitely wasn't necessarily too excited to go into this lift, but we had to finish strong regardless. And the goal was really just to go 3 for 3. We didn't really care about a PR. We didn't really care how heavy he went. We didn't necessarily have any objective number goals. He just wanted to finish the day off strong and walk away with just the third attempt on the day. So we opened with 235 kilos or 517 pounds, a weight that he had taken with relative ease in the past, and it moves fairly well. Daniel has a little bit of a sticking point towards his lockout, which we would look to address in the off season, but this moved fairly well. I've seen this move a little bit better, but I've also seen it move relatively worse. So we took a smaller jump, only 10 kilos to 245 kilos instead of the planned 12.5 kilo jump to 247 kilos. Daniel came into his second attempt feeling a little bit more confident after the opener. We knew that deadlifts would be there on the day, and we knew that the strategy that we used to taper deadlifts worked fairly well. So 245 kilos moved very easily, and we took the safe 7.5 kilo jump to 242.5 kilos, which was only 2.5 kilos underneath his all-time best PR. Now, looking back on this attempt, we probably had another, 10 pounds, 15 pounds on the day. This moved extremely, extremely well. Definitely could have been a second attempt, but we were glad we were able to have a pretty strong showing on deadlifts. We were glad that we were able to finish the day off 3 for 3. And regardless of how squat went and how bench went, we were really glad that the lift that we thought would go the worst actually went the best for us. So that's the meet. Daniel finished with a 15 kilo meet PR and a 12 dots PR, but we walked away with a performance that we weren't necessarily proud of. Though there was some performance issues, what made this day a quote unquote bad meet was the fact that we set our expectations a little bit too high, especially with squat, knowing that squat would set the momentum for the rest of the day, and knowing that squat was a lift that Daniel takes a lot of pride in. Setting the expectation to be a lot higher than what he had on the day definitely made it. So his confidence after that failed third attempt squat was just shot down to an all-time low, and that just set the tone for the rest of the day. Daniel's an incredibly strong, gifted, and also very, very hardworking lifter. And I know that this is just going to be a stepping stone leading into a fantastic, fantastic meet that we're going to have next time. Please subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys next time.